Let's go to John McTernan, political strategist for the PR agency BCW, who was the director of political operations for Sir Tony Blair during his final 2 years as Prime Minister, and Andrew Fisher, former senior policy advisor to Jeremy Corbyn. First you, John. Labour's obviously had a great few days, but what are the chinks here? What should they be worried about, if anything at all? John.
Oh, look, Labour should be worried where any part of its core vote goes away from it. It was worried when the red wall turned away. It's been worried for a long time since Labour voters in Scotland went to the SNP, and it should be worried that voters are turning away from us on the issue of Gaza and voting for the Greens or voting for independent parties.
Or not voting at all, as we heard from some callers.
Yeah, no. Well, local elections have always got a low turnout, so it's kind of hard to judge why people didn't go to vote unless you actually do surveys, which I haven't seen. But no, Labour needs to win back a load of votes. Labour's won across the country in the place it needs to win, but it also does need first to do much more clear communication on the fact that its position on Gaza changed. Not only changed, Labour won a vote in Parliament, which then forced the government to change its view and made the government vote at the UN Security Council for a ceasefire. So Labour's had a huge real-world impact, but it's time to let people back into the party. It's time to talk to the councillors who've gone independent and actually seek to create unity to win the country in every place we can win at the general election.
I guess the problem is that even though, and I pointed this out at the beginning of this hour, Labour did change its position and it did force that vote, as you said. The Israelis are still pummeling Gaza. They still intend to go into Rafah. And so what people, in the absence of any actual change of policy, unless we get a permanent ceasefire or a lasting one, in the absence of that, people will remember those most trenchant comments at the beginning of this whole war.
Sure. Keir said clearly in that quote that international law should be respected. There's huge questions now about whether international law is being requested. There's a case at the ICJ. There's a case for actually suspending arms exports to Israel. And there's a case for being much clearer about our criticism of the actions of the Israeli army and armed forces, and of the strategy, the utterly insane strategy of Benjamin Netanyahu, the idea that Hamas can be destroyed, completely eradicated, and the people who are paying the cost of that are ordinary Palestinians, men, women, and children who are being slaughtered. And civilian casualties are not a necessary byproduct of war. Yeah. So there's an anger and a passion out in the country, and Labour has to channel every single bit of anger and passion which aligns with its views and its values. And so, Labour needs to do a much better job of communicating and reunifying our party and connecting with our base.
John McTernan, you sound actually more negative than I thought you would sound. Stay on the line. I want to bring in Andrew Fisher, former senior policy advisor to Jeremy Corbyn. Andrew, do you agree with John?
Broadly, yes. I think, Labour's done well in making gains in the places it needs to win in an election, like Thurrock, Milton Keynes, Swindon, the East Midlands, Redditch, Hartlepool, Stevenage. It's had some very good results where it's just a straight fight between Labour and the Tories. But the other thing, which alarms both me and John by the sounds of it, is that it's really lost a lot of its kind of progressive coalition, a lot of young people, not just Muslim voters, but them as well, over the issue of Gaza, but not just Gaza. Also
green policies, right?
Green policies. I think the dilution of the green policies has definitely given the Greens a fillip in particular. The U-turn on scrapping tuition fees as well. If you look at some of the places where Labour's lost votes, they've got high student populations as well. I think that's a factor. And I think as well, and John made sort of covert reference to it as well. Some of the people who've been suspended, like Diane Abbott, there's a bit of division and a bit of disillusionment amongst the party's base as well. And that makes a difference in elections. Activists going out, knocking on doors. If you don't have your full machine out, you're not going to get the best possible results. Right. And I think that's played a role as well.
But playing devil's advocate here, is it not possible to argue that and actually losing the support of people like Dan Abbott, losing the support of young activists who are now going to vote, or voters who are going to vote Green, losing the support of some of the voters, Muslim voters who are upset by the policy on Gaza, is the kind of bloodletting, the proof, if you like, that they have moved to the centre ground, that they're going to try and steal back some of those, disgruntled Tory voters, who voted for the Tories in the past, but are now so upset they might go Labour in the big cities, or indeed in the Red Wall especially. Is that not the argument here, that it's a trade-off and it's a painful one, but they'd rather go to the centre and get some of those disgruntled centrist voters back than to stick with the left?
I understand your point, but I don't think it's either or. I don't think if we'd had a better position on Gaza, I don't think we'd be losing seats like Redditch or Hartlepool or Stevenage. So I don't think that trade-off works in reverse. I think because we got our message wrong on Gaza, because we unnecessarily watered down our green policies, I think we've lost a bit of that edge. And I don't think that would have any negative effect on the other side. So I think there is a real risk. And if you look at party membership as well, it's plummeted quite badly in recent months as well. And that's not a good sign. In the run-up to an election where Labour's likely to win, normally you'd expect, as there was in the run-up to 1997, as John will remember, a big surge in Labour Party membership. That's going in the opposite direction. And that should worry people as well, because activists on the ground are the people who, do get out the vote on election day. And we've seen, differential turnouts. We've seen people moving away from because of policy issues as well. And that should definitely alarm Labour. I mean, looking at the local election results, we would have lost Blackburn. We would have lost Bristol Central at the general election. You don't want to be losing parliamentary seats. There are others where perhaps in the West Midlands we might have lost as well if other factors went our way as well. We don't know yet. We haven't seen the breakdown of the West Midlands result. But clearly there are warning signs for the Labour Party that if they don't get things right, they're going to lose a lot of what is their natural, as John said, core base. And we saw the results of what happened when we lost our core base in Scotland and indeed in 2019, where we lost what were deemed the Red Wall seats.
John McTernan, is Rishi Sunak Keir Starmer's best election asset? Is the fact that the Tories have been in power for 14 years and have failed to deliver on many of their promises, have put her through a sort of psychodrama rollercoaster ride. Is that his best asset? And is that enough to put him over the finishing line in the general election?
Look, Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, Theresa May and David Cameron are all huge assets for the Labour Party because they've shown the Tory party are unfit to govern because an unstable political party can't actually safely govern a country like Britain in the world which is changing, the world in which we've got to go green. I honestly think that actually the combination of the commitment to growth through ripping up the planning that holds back infrastructure building and house building, the commitment to a green prosperity plan that is actually now in its smaller form the same size per capita as President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. That and the workers' rights package, which is a really the most radical package of extending workers' rights for a generation. Those are huge planks.
And they've been ditched.
No, they've not been ditched.
Some of them have been ditched, right?
None of them have been ditched.
Well, hang on. The Green Revolution has been ditched. I mean,
I said it's the same size now per capita on its scaled back size.
Is it?
As the Inflation Reduction Act. It is. No, it's true. It is true. The per capita. The whole thing is the presentation of the debate around it missed the point. That
right. What about the workers' rights plans? Because that's also there are reports.
It's not been ditched.
No, it's not been ditched, but there are reports that it might get ditched.
No, there are not. There are reports. Yeah. It's going to be consulted on. Even Margaret Thatcher consulted on her changes when she smashed trade union rights. Every employment law change is consulted on. But the point I want to come back to is the question you made about should Labour be thinking we're best to gain votes in the centre. The centre ground of British politics has changed. And that is the huge lesson of these elections.
In what way? Explain that.
The whole of the media elite are focusing on the battle between the Tories and Reform. That is a third of the votes in the country. 2/3 of voters in the UK, in poll after poll after poll, and in these elections, are voting Labour, Lib Dem, Green, Independent, and Nationalist. It's 2/3 of the country vote Progressive. Labour should be worrying if it doesn't acknowledge and doesn't respect and doesn't address the fact the centre of British politics has moved, and the Labour government in office
moved to the left.
You should own the centre left, but we've got to say we're Social Democrats,
right?
Of course, there'll be times when if you're a Green, vote for a Green. If you're a Liberal Democrat, vote for a Liberal Democrat. Social Democrats have a particular set of policies. That's what the country wants.
Okay.
So for me, that's the lesson.
Interesting. So let me just bring in Andrew Fisher, because he was both shaking his head and then nodding. So I'm slightly confused, Andrew, about what do you think of what John had to say.
Well, I agree with parts of what John said and disagree with others. But, I think broadly he's right that the centre ground of politics has moved. And if we look at opinion polling on things, public ownership of the railways, which is another Labour policy which hasn't been diluted, I'm glad to say, is massively backed. In fact, the overwhelming majority of Tory voters back public ownership of the railways. I would hope Labour will wake up and see the same is true of water, where we've got Thames Water, which is virtually bankrupt, the rest of the water companies polluting our seas and rivers, and actually we want that back in public ownership as well. A majority of Tory voters want that. So the centre ground has shifted. I think Labour could be a lot bolder on progressive taxation. I think it will need to be to fund public services in office, because if it's going to clear the NHS backlog, if it's going to sort out social care, if it's going to resolve the shortage of teachers in our schools, it's got to put more funding in. And at the moment, it hasn't really got an answer on that. But that's not played a big role in these local elections. As John said, I think it's right that Labour needs to reflect on where the centre ground now is, on the fact it can lose votes very easily to the Liberal Democrats, to the Greens, to independents. And we've seen areas now where the Greens and independents are getting organised in that space that Labour's vacated. And that should worry the Labour Party.
OK, but should it worry them enough that they might actually lose the next election as a result of all this?
No, I don't think they're going to lose the next election, because, as John said, the Tories are in a terrible state. The country's in a terrible state. They are on their way out. Labour will win the next election. But when you're in government, you've got to have a coalition of support, and you've got to have a plan to improve things. And some pieces of that are missing at the moment.
OK, Andrew Fisher, John McTernan, fascinating stuff. Thank you very much to both of you.